Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kevin Williams. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at SALISES. Today's webinar is just one of many engagements that we expect to have with the public. We expect to raise topical issues to inform policies right across, not just in Jamaica, but right across the Caribbean. Today's theme is Decolonizing Development Today, Rethinking Caribbean Development, Paradigms and Practice. It's a privilege to be here with such a distinguished group of scholars, practitioners, and thought leaders as we delve into one of the most pressing and transformative conversations of our time. Today, we are not simply engaging in an academic discussion, but in a critical reflection on the way forward for the Caribbean. We'll be exploring how traditional development models, often shaped by external influences, have impacted the Caribbean's social, economic, and political landscapes. We'll also examine the urgent need for rethinking of development practices to address the region's unique challenges, from historical colonialism to contemporary global inequalities. As we embark on this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, let us consider how we can reshape development frameworks that are not just imposed, but are responsive to the Caribbean's rich historical and social realities. Decolonizing development is also about centering the voices, values, and visions of the people of the Caribbean. And it is an invitation to critically reassess the systems of knowledge and power that continue to influence our futures. As I encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, you all will engage in an actively challenging and shared diverse insights as we collectively work forward to a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable Caribbean. As we all know, this is a pivotal moment to reflect, reimagine, and rebuild the Caribbean's development trajectory in a way that is authentically rooted in our collective aspirations. Let's make this opportunity to shape our way forward a fruitful one, and hopefully we expect some ideas, some insights that we can use to shape policies going forward. Thank you again. So at this point, I'm going to invite our university director, Prof. Dan Marshall, Professor of International Political Economy, to make welcome remarks. Over to you, Prof. Marshall.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome everyone to what I hope will be an energizing conversation that begins to unsettle as much as disturb traditional and orthodox paradigms and what we mean about development. We are really looking at the career of development as a field of study, as an insight, as a paradigm. And this conversation that we're leading here at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute is part and parcel of, and indeed enmeshed in the research work by a number of colleagues within the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute and outside within the broader UWI and other Caribbeanists working in other spaces. There's been a need to bring together in one space, as it were, we'll have to say a virtual space, these several heterodox approaches to looking at development. So we know that there are an efflorescence of approaches coming from feminists, coming from those concerned about the environment, coming from progressive scholarship and progressive traditions, coming from even within orthodox schools about how we think about growth, how we think about development, how we think about development as justice, how we think about development as well-living. And indeed, all of this is about how do we construct societies that will project experiments in well-being, experiments in justice, in the promotion of development as justice. And indeed, how do we improve the life chances of the majority as we answer the question that Sylvia Winter constantly puts before us: what does it mean to be human? And indeed, I want to commend the framers behind this particular initiative. This would include persons like Dr. Patricia Northover and her team there at SALISES Mona. And I will also, at this time, also signal to you that we are continuing this conversation at our upcoming Sir Arthur Lewis Conference, as it will be the 26th Annual SALISES Conference. And the title is Reimagining Society and Value, much like what we're doing here, reimagining society and value as part of building resilience in small states. Indeed, some of the sub-themes look at the question of the well-living paradigm. What does that mean in terms of actualizing the vision in a small developing state context? The centrality of gender and women's labor in unpacking notions of value, productivity, and time. Reimagining a more sustainable, resilient food system towards sustainable, just futures. These are some of the sub-themes of the conference, which extends the conversation that we're going to have here. And I want to say a special welcome and looking forward to your participation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Marshall. I'm going to invite our director at Mona, Prof. Waller, Professor of Digital Transformation and Governance, to also make a few welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. All protocols observed. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this timely and critical discussion on decolonizing Caribbean development. I'm indeed honored to open this webinar today and to engage with some of what I would consider, and Kevin has already articulated, as some of the leading scholars and practitioners working on the transformation of our region as well as other regions. At its core, today's conversation is about rethinking development on our terms for our people. The Caribbean has had a long history of being shaped by colonial legacies that continue to influence economic models, governance structures, knowledge production, and social discourses. But in this 21st century moment, that we're facing a lot of global shifts in technology, geopolitics, economics, climate change, we must ask some critical questions. Whose development are we advancing? Whose knowledge systems are we privileging? How do we create a Caribbean-led development paradigm that centers around equity, justice, sustainability, and livelihoods? And I hope that these are some of the issues that will be discussed today in this very important discussion. Decolonization is not, or discourses surrounding decolonization is not just a theoretical or philosophical discussion. It's a practical necessity. Whether we examine trade policies, education systems, digital transformation, or climate resilience, the Caribbean must take ownership of its development trajectory. We must not be passive recipients of global policies, but active architects of our own futures. SALISES has historically been committed to rigorous policy-driven research and continues to champion this examination of economic, political, and social frameworks that have historically disadvantaged our regions. And this webinar is just another step in fostering these discussions that have historically and still do lead to policy shifts, institutional reforms, and grassroots solutions. And I'd like to congratulate Pat and her team in terms of brainstorming this very timely and important discussion, and timely in the context of what is happening in the United States, and timely in the sense of what is happening globally regarding technology, which I'll discuss in my presentation a little later. So in fact, we are indeed privileged to have with us today a distinguished panel of scholars and practitioners who will provide valuable insights on how we can rethink, reclaim, and reimagine development for the Caribbean. I extend my gratitude to the presenters today. And at the end of the session today, I hope that we will have not just questions, but actionable pathways for transforming Caribbean development and the Caribbean development paradigm, I should say. So let today be a space where we challenge old assumptions, build new alliances, and reaffirm our commitment to a Caribbean future shaped by our own vision, values, and voices. Let us not just rethink development, let us actively redefine it. Thank you, and I look forward to the wonderful panel discussion today. Welcome, everyone.
Indeed, Professor, I must tell you, at this time, it is critically important that we take charge of our own development, given what's going on in the world. You have nationalist governments sweeping the world. You know, they're looking internally. Okay,
Indeed.
so we have to take charge of our own development. So I would like to invite the brains behind this webinar, Dr. Northover, development economist and senior fellow at SALISES. Over to you, colleague.
Greetings, everyone, wherever you are in the world today. Solidarities. We've really had a rich opening already in terms of the remarks, and I'm just going to add a few in terms of introducing the webinar concept and contextualizing it in the context of Caribbean challenges. So the Caribbean, as we know, faces a unique set of challenges in navigating the complex and evolving landscape of global development, but is often subject to disproportionate levels of vulnerability due to the legacies of colonialism and their exposure to climate change. Moreover, our troubles are deepening despite the many articulations of bold visions and plans for development. Such contradictory outcomes are shaped by the fact that the region's encounter with development has always been shaped in the crucibles of globalization, imperialism, and colonialism. As such, the character of our development has always tended to be racializing, patriarchal, extractive, and disaster-prone. Not surprisingly, then, the region is often distinguished by the fact of its high levels of socioeconomic inequalities, endemic violence, corruption, chronic indebtedness, weak social welfare systems, degraded environments, weak innovation systems, and anemic growth. Having emerged from the socioeconomic shocks of global recession and then a global health pandemic, the Caribbean is still facing the headwinds of a belligerent declining empire and a volatile new multipolar world order. As the US, under the presidency of Donald Trump, seeks to rewrite its imperial policies in the context of the rise of the far right and the promotion of a racial supremacy doctrine condensed in the language of Make America Great Again, the Caribbean has entered an inflection point in history and must seek to advance a decolonial development imprint for the Caribbean. The USA's own efforts at delinking and/or calibration of its aid and foreign policy agenda, while a cause for concern, given our fiscal challenges in the region, may actually be a catalyst for decolonizing the development imaginary. In this context, then, of the Caribbean's unique challenges and vulnerabilities, it is time for leadership and independent thought for realizing the Caribbean people's own best vision of a development unshackled from overbearing colonial imperatives and decisive in confronting colonial legacies for our fullest freedom. This opening forum on decolonizing Caribbean development will focus on the global agenda and change processes. Subsequently, in additional webinars, we will open up the floor to rethinking, as Professor Waller asked, and redefining the meaning of this complex object of development from the standpoint of grassroots communities, civil society organizations across the region. This will be complemented by academic and public sector perspectives, as well as other stakeholders who wish to or are invited to offer position papers on Caribbean development options that do not simply rehearse more of the same. Our next webinar is projected for March the 18th, and we also anticipate building a partnership with the United Nations Development Program for promoting these decolonial dialogues to spur thought, research, and action.
Thank you, Dr. Northover, for basically outlining the path for future seminars. So our next speaker is Dr. Ramona Biholar. She will make some opening remarks on introducing the right to development from a colonial rights perspective. Dr. Ramona is the Deputy Dean of Graduate Studies and Research, and she's also a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law here at Mona. She's a socio-legal scholar whose teaching, research, and publications focus on the Caribbean and intersect primarily in areas of international human rights, implementation of human rights treaties, policy formulation and practice, gender justice, the right to development, and so on. So Dr. Ramona, the floor is yours to make open remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Northover and SALISES team for inviting me to bring opening remarks to this timely webinar, which promises a fascinating and crucial discussion for today's realities, as you mentioned, that intends to shed light on the Caribbean's strategic options for aligning its development objectives with appropriate international standards and expectations, while staying true to its unique sociocultural and historical identity and heritage. To open this session that aims to rethink and reshape development and take action, as Professor Waller indicated in his remarks, I briefly introduce the right to development, and I argue that this right has the potential to disrupt the status quo and make profound demands to address the deep-seated systemic inequities and imbalances at the global level. The right to development, as it has been conceptualized and articulated in the Declaration on the Right to Development in 1986 and in the Vienna Declaration and Platform for Action 1993, is a complex right. Its multiple facets illustrate, one, that all human rights are critical for development processes, the right of development being an enabling right conducive to the realization of all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Two, respect for the principles of equality, non-discrimination, and fair distribution of development benefits are core in development processes. Three, the individual and peoples are subjects instead of objects of development. Four, the individual and peoples are active participants in deciding his, her, their own reality. Five, development processes involve the satisfaction of both material and immaterial or non-material needs. Six, individual and collective independence and people's self-determination are crucial to development processes. This is indicative of the fact that the human right to development makes demands of transparency and accountability in decision-making processes of development and places the empowerment of individuals and peoples at its center. Thus, the human right to development is an accountability tool. This right is also a decolonial right that connects reformist calls for a critical shift in the international economic order with an acknowledgement of the hierarchical relationships of power between nations emerging from histories of colonial oppression, extractivism, and violence. For example, the Declaration on the Right to Development recognizes in Article 5 that human rights violations prevailing in contemporary societies may be rooted in the historical institutions and processes of apartheid, racism and racial discrimination, colonialism, foreign domination, and occupation. It specifically points to the historical and present asymmetries of power emerging largely from colonial relations between what's called developed and developing nations, challenging the historical exclusion of peoples and developing countries and their individuals, and demanding accountability and redress for violations of the past that have consequences in the present. This goes hand in hand with reparatory justice calls, which I understand as operationalizing two important components according to Bernard Boxill's theory of justice: a backward-looking responsibility contingent on the injustice committed, thus an obligation to repair, and a forward-looking responsibility aiming to remedy a present situation, which can be seen as a tool for development. From such an understanding, I highlight the nexus between the right to development as a human right and calls for reparatory justice that are particularly important for the Caribbean. The right to development has thus the potential to make a normative contribution to reparation calls, not only because of the explicit condemnation of colonialism in Article 5, as I mentioned, but also because it demands action from states with a view to provide developing countries, I quote, with appropriate means to foster their comprehensive development, end of quote. And this would be Article 4, paragraph 2 of the Declaration on the Right to Development. It requires equitable participation in the process of and to development, and demands a deep scrutiny of practices that are based on inequalities and discrimination in all its forms. So the right to development insists that besides the international community, developed states are duty bearers in relation to developing countries, which becomes rights holders under this right. And explaining the international dimension of this right, the UN Secretary General stated in 1979 that the right contains the duty to repair in order to make amends for the historical exploitation by colonial powers. So I'd like thus to put forward the idea that in this way, the human right to development makes space for other logics that expose colonial histories of injustice, as Kamari Clark mentioned, make space for new non-Western meanings, sensibilities, meaning inclusive ways of listening to, seeing, and grasping other nations and people's experiences, and also make space for other calls for other logics of justice. By demanding accountability for colonial histories of oppression and injustice, the right to development, like calls for reparations, exposes tensions, hierarchies, and historical relations of power between the global North and global South in the contemporary world, and embeds a discourse that poses resistance, disputes, and disrupts well-established structures and hierarchies. Like calls for reparations, this right has been fervently opposed by developed nations in the global North. Its multifaceted content and demanding nature has led to over 3 decades of indecision among the world's governments regarding its recognition in an international legally binding human rights document. In fact, the right to development has been coined as controversial, leading to scholarly disagreements, political polarization, and calls for its dissolution, which stifle its transformative potential at global levels. So while contested especially by developed countries in the global North, the right to development has been recognized in normative frameworks in countries from the global South, especially in African and Asian contexts. More so, a convention on the right to development has been drafted and ready by January 2020, with a final decision still being pending. The chair of the expert drafting group on the legally binding instrument on the right to development, Mihir Kanade, explained that the drafting process has been confronted with many obstacles, among which, quote, were the political divergence among states split across north-south lines, end of quote, regarding the necessity of an international treaty and its contents. It becomes clear that this would be a game-changing convention, challenging the dominant narrative of international law by adopting a global legally binding treaty on the right to development. I would thus conclude that the right to development and reparatory justice are interconnected. Both call for holding the relevant states accountable for the historical injustices presently affecting developing societies, and both require those states to repair. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish most fruitful panel discussion that explores ways forward, that harmonize global ambitions with local identities, that empower Caribbean nations and communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Biholar, to speak to the conscience of the global North, to consider reparatory justice for the enslaved, and the abused of this world and their descendants. Okay, so we're circling back to our colleague, Dr. Pat Northover, to address the question, whither development? Dr. Northover.
Thank you. Greetings again, everyone. Can you see my screen and my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be looking at development with a long view and bringing us up to speed in terms of perceptions and approaches to the development project. In the context of modern times, the idea of development appears like a Procrustean racial concept that lends itself to violence. From the Merriam-Webster and the Google Cambridge Language's definition of Procrustean, this is a term that points to an arbitrary and often ruthless disregard of individual differences and special circumstances. It comes from, according to Wikipedia, a Greek mythology where Procrustes was a rogue smith and bandit from Attica who attacked people by stretching them and cutting off their legs so as to force them to fit the size of an iron bed. Thinking about the modern drama of development from the perspective of those whose differences have been construed by others as a lack of proper being or backwardness, an encounter with development, whether framed as modernization, modernity, capitalist progress, or civilization, has invariably been an encounter with a similar type of rogue violence that inhabits imperial designs intent on remaking the world in its image to achieve a one world vision and totalizing domination over all. However, to what extent have we moved on from this original sin of development? In its unfolding political materiality, is development today still racial, still violent? Has the brutish work for development become free of the need of what Marx called the violence of primitive accumulation? That is, where others are eliminated in the logic of genocide or ethnic cleansing, or subordinated and dispossessed, and dehumanized to become things, commodities, bodies, and resources just for profit, the reproduction of capital as a social relation, or as well for the accumulation of imperial power and colonial rule in the New World. What would count then as new scenes of development in relationship to the Caribbean? Some new origin stories of development could come from the post-war period. Truman's Point Forth Plan in 1949 gives us the US imperial gaze and the invention of underdevelopment, the birth of the post-war development project to counter the Soviet threat. Here we have the rise of modernization theories of development, in particular, Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth, which was subtitled A Non-Communist Manifesto. But prior to that, we can trace another origin story in the Moyne Commission, the British West Indies Moyne Commission of 1938-1939 that came on the heels of massive Caribbean labor uprising and unrest, and which articulated a vision of colonial trusteeship or the will to improve based on the implementation of a UK colonial social welfare policy, putting manufacturing at the margins. Then we have the decolonial struggles by the damned for their own path, to exercise a sovereignty from below for their right to development. In the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1960s, popular uprising of Caribbean peoples. We have the emergence of the towering figure of Arthur Lewis and the rise of development economics. Arthur Lewis was one of the first to articulate a case for reparations and racial uplift. And he saw this as being possible through industrialization policy. This was stated in his 1938 and 1950 works on labor in the West Indies and industrialization for the British West Indies. He also launched the economic development with unlimited supplies of labor, which was duly recognized with a Nobel laureate prize in 1979, which he wrote in 1954. He also wrote his magnum opus, Theory of Economic Growth, in 1955, which emphasized the interdisciplinary and complex processes of development, looking at issues of population, the nature of the state, institutions, incentives, knowledge, and imperial formations. Then we have the classic arguments of Frantz Fanon, who began his career at just 27, writing on Black Skin, White Mask, and his seminal work, which is called by Stuart Hall, the Decolonial Manifesto, The Wretched of the Earth. So in fact, we could look at different ways of conceptualizing the moving trajectory of a will to improve through these different origin stories of development, with the first two being articulated through imperial and colonial lenses, desiring to control the process of sovereign demands for a right to development. We now move into the dialectic of coloniality then. The Caribbean Development Project is entangled in a dynamic dialectic of coloniality where development, is being both contested and shaped by colonial and decolonial forces and interests. And we see this happening right throughout the history of development from the inception of modernity. However, is it not still a rigged power play if development continues to discipline countries? For example, in the case of Africa, as Gerardo Serra has commented, and I quote, "The protean notion of development constitutes the main framework through which the performance, structure, and aspirations of the African continent are usually expressed in Western discourse." In what ways does this discourse shape contemporary Caribbean development realities? Thus, beyond what decolonial scholars have emphasized and called a coloniality of being, rooted in racial power, racial colonial capitalism, one must simultaneously recognize the Procrustean power of development in the coloniality of knowledge, given its operation through what Decker and McConnell have called the development episteme. This development episteme refers to, and this is a quote, "the knowledge system that claims that there are real measurable differences in development between nations, societies, or social groups. It is the, quote unquote, scientific concept that some societies are developed and others are undeveloped, less developed, or in the process of developing." Is development still a Procrustean racial idea, then, if we, the colonially wounded people of the region, desire it? If development becomes what Frantz Fanon and Frank Wilderson have described as a libidinal economy, still articulated by what Mignola has described as a colonial matrix of power? How have Caribbean development scholars expressed such complex desires for development in the post-colony? Is it animated by double movements of development? And here I introduce the practice of writing development with a big D and a little d. Big D as a colonial matrix of power, sustaining racial colonial disaster capitalism, as I call it. And little d as the decolonial struggles for social justice, local economic transformation, and full freedom. In this context, for looking at the post-independence period, which has its roots in the 1940s, as we saw earlier, the 1970s and 80s were pivotal moments in Caribbean development thinking. We have the rise of Caribbean dependency theory, the plantation school, for example, and the eclectic structuralist critiques of unequal exchange and underdevelopment. Demands for inequality, redress, and structural change via policies like import substitution and nationalization projects for regulating capitalist development. We also have in this period the pull of democratic socialist policies for social equity, gender justice, and the uplift of the subaltern classes. The desire for a new international economic order and a delinking from capitalist trade networks. But as in every process of change, there is a dialectic of law of action and reaction, which is the emergence of neoliberalism and globalization as a new motive of development. This can be traced from as early as the 1970s to the present, with the rise of neoliberalism and the effort to dismantle development theory and the development state in the context of debt crises and globalization. It begins with the Chilean neoliberal experiment, with the defeat of Salvador Allende and the rise of the authoritarian liberal state under the dictator Augusto Pinochet. It is characterized by the rise of the Washington Consensus in the 1980s, getting the prices right, shaping neoliberal economic policy agendas of the IBRD or the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to derail the developmental state agenda that was introduced in the 1970s earlier under the Caribbean radical tradition. It reflects in this moment the crisis of development theory, the demonization of state interventions, and the call for the end of development economics, for replacing it with a one-size-fits-all economic policy agenda to engineer capitalist growth, unlimited, apparently, under neoliberal globalization. This moment of this dialectical moment also reflects the rise of new institutional economics and new growth theory from the 1970s and 1980s. So you're seeing overlapping waves of processes of trying to control a process of change, as well as to liberate oneself from these hegemonic constructs. They're overlapping in their moments of emergence and in their contestation. So even from the 1970s, we have the opening up of order liberal spaces which introduce a conservative role for institutions, such as the management of property rights in favor of the capitalist elite, and investment policy and development, largely through incentives for foreign direct investment, but also in terms of the shift towards a sustainable development, where we are now using institutions to help and laws to help manage the commons. I will close by focusing on this final phase, if you wish, this developmental decolonization project, which is summarized in Bob Marley's famous song against the Babylon system, which says, "We refuse to be what you want us to be." Here we see submerged perspectives pierce through the entanglement of power to differentially organize the meanings of social and political life. And that's a quote from Macarena Gomez Barrez in her book, The Extractive Zone, Social Economies and Decolonial Perspectives. So in our current moment, even as we're wrestling with the vagaries of liberalism and globalization, the rise of the far right and the retreat of versions of imperial design, the 21st century has seen a range of theoretical postures emerge from post-colonialism to decolonial thinking that have confronted the colonial moves embedded in development with a big D. This project has been confronted to its core. And some of the new ideas that I just want to highlight in closing that are challenging the coloniality of being, knowledge, and power are as follows. Those projects that are emphasizing the powers of re-existencing, emphasizing non-capitalist paths of development, alternatives to the patriarchal, racial, and capitalist models of development with a big D. Pluriversal seeking epistemic and ontological sovereignty. Here an emphasis on the complex relational ethics with the earth and with each other. Many worlds in one, not a single narrative, not a single universal history. New meanings emerging of the good life, drawing on indigenous cosmologies in the Americas, for example, Buen Vivir or good living, which is the indigenous communities concept, Sumak Kaswe, or from Afro-descendant peoples, alternative languages, concept fields emergent out of the language of Ubuntu. Lastly, I want to emphasize that there are also the powers of rethinking and reimagining that are coming to the forefront, where capitalism is seen as archaeology. And in this thesis, there is a rejection of capitalism as an abstract, monolithic system to assess, rather, the diverse practices and mechanisms that are generative of the effects that we call processes of change or development. So with that overall whirlwind view, I would like to conclude my presentation and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Pat, for that broad sweep of the path of development from our historical experience up to our present setting. It's a nice way to pivot into the second part of our webinar, i.e. the panel discussion. This phase of the webinar comprised of 4 speakers, and the sub-theme for this panel discussion is navigating global change, decolonizing global agendas. Our first speaker in this phase of the panel discussion is Dr. Usha Natarajan. And each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. And at the end of all presentations, then we'll have question and answers for about 25 minutes. So we're going to allow all the speakers to speak, and then at the end we have question and answers. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Usha Natarajan, and she's a law and political faculty fellow at Yale Law School. She's also a visiting professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute, honorary fellow at SALISES here, and also senior fellow at Melbourne Law School. And she's going to speak on the important topic, critique of law in international development. It's over to you, Dr. Usha.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. And thank you, SALISES, for including me in this conversation. And special thanks to Pat, whose work I've been learning a lot from since we met at the SALISES annual conference last year. So let me start by sharing my slides. Okay. All right, so I should start by saying I'm an international lawyer, and I've been part of the law and development conversation across the Global South for the last 25 years as a scholar and as a practitioner. And I'm part of this global movement called TWAIL, which is short for Third World Approaches to International Law, which is a very large and growing network of legal scholars and practitioners that essentially aim to unpack and deconstruct the colonial legacies of international law and that engage in decolonizing the lived realities of the peoples of the Global South through rupturing and radically transforming the international order that governs us. So if you want to learn more about TWAIL, one way is to check out the TWAIL Review, which is an open access peer-reviewed international law journal, and it's online, so anyone can go there. And it's dedicated to international law scholarship from the Global South. And I'm very happy to note also that Dr. Ramona Biholar and Dr. Yentl Williams have started a TWAIL hub at Mumilla, which is very exciting news. So in my 15 minutes today, I'm going to briefly revisit 3 questions that folks from the Global South need to continually return to and reinterrogate. What is development? What is law? The relationship between law and development, and fourth and most importantly, who decides the answers to these questions. So being able to answer these questions on our own terms, in our own languages, across the Global South is key to empowerment and agency when it comes to law and development. So in terms of what is development, I won't spend too much time on this because both Pat and Ramona have discussed it. So essentially, mainstream development discourse spreads these false assumptions about societal progress, one of which is that all societies tread this linear path, nomadic to pastoral to agricultural to industrial to post-industrial life. And another is that limitless social progress is possible. And a third is that social hierarchies are somewhat natural. So these assumptions are obviously largely imaginary, and they're not borne out by history, they're not borne out by science. For example, while northern measures of development relegate the Global South to this primitive past and the North to this developed future, obviously if we measure development very differently, in terms of ecological footprints, it would be the South that's developed and the North that has to transform. And so depending on which measurement we use, obviously we can imagine different paths. Crucially, the reason why these sorts of assumptions matter is that the development industry, whether domestically or internationally or bilaterally, operates on the assumption that everyone can travel this path and that everyone should travel this path. But the path is, of course, it's impossible. That the northern development was fueled by genocide and colonialism and slavery and apartheid and racial discrimination. The Global South cannot follow this development pathway, and we should not follow this development pathway. So today, as in the past, this form of development is only achievable through mass exploitation and suffering. And this is evidenced in these accelerating inequalities between states and within states in the world today. And it's also, of course, a scientific impossibility because the Earth cannot support the expansion of northern levels of consumption and waste. We would need 9 Earths, we would need 9 planets for everyone to live like the average inhabitant of the United States. So why do states and people believe as though this is possible? Behave as though this is possible, with everyone everywhere all at once trying to, develop, because the very richest are also still, pursuing development. So who benefits from this type of behavior? Who benefits from this belief? Well, that's pretty clear that it's the rich who continue to accumulate. So Oxfam calculated that billionaire wealth surged by $2 trillion last year alone. So billionaire wealth has risen 3 times faster in 2024 than it did in 2023. While the number of people living in poverty has barely changed since 1990. So in terms of, what can we do about this? People have been trying to do things about this for centuries. There are and there always have been alternative visions for development. And we have, movements across the global South since colonial times, and especially since the 1950s and the wave of decolonization, different understandings of autarky, of self-reliance, of the new international economic order, food sovereignty movements, and so on. And we have this transnational solidarity for change, and we see this in diverse peasant movements, indigenous movements, labor movements, environmental justice movements. So there are various anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-colonial movements that are working towards their own articulations of development, and they're asserting their ability to decide for themselves what happiness is, what a good life looks like, on their own terms, and so evidencing this ability to transcend capitalist addictions to consumption and waste, fueled by this limitless discontent, and the insatiable greed and envy that fuels this type of development. So a way of life that is not dependent on harming others and on irreparably harming the earth that sustains us. So turning now to what is the role of law in all of this, I'm going to start with international law and institutions because that's the discipline that I'm part of, and then you'll see where domestic law comes in as I go on. So international law is a direct byproduct of the colonial encounter. The creators of international law, such as Victoria in Spain and Grotius in the Netherlands, created an international law to justify the movement of Europeans into the non-European world and the behavior of Europeans once they got there. So that's the origins of international law. And since then, international laws and institutions have served as this vehicle for Eurocentric interests writ large, where the West remains the norm, and law is very good at providing the norm and the normal, from which concepts such as the human, the state and development and human rights, sustainable development, good governance, corruption, terrorism, and all these other so-called international legal concepts derive their meaning from this Western norm. And so people and states who deviate from these norms are incentivized then to fall into line through international institutions, through these alternative sort of carrot and stick approaches over time. So development is a key part of international law because international laws and institutions are very efficient means of universalizing Western economic interests. Essentially, a condition for being an independent sovereign state was that communities across the global South had to commit to development in the Western sense. So all states today are essentially developmental states. They can exist on this ideological spectrum from left to right, capitalist or non-aligned or communist or whatever, but no state can actually defy the will to develop altogether and remain a state. Societies that try to do this are essentially denied sovereignty. And you see that in the fate of tribal and indigenous communities worldwide that are still struggling for independence and self-determination. So international law continues to play a key role in the development of the global North and the underdevelopment of the global South. So one very obvious example is if we consider the legality of colonialism and slavery and piracy and apartheid and genocide and racial discrimination, mass migration, forming these settler colonies. So all of these were fundamental to European development. But of course, all those practices are illegal today, at least if they're undertaken by the global South. So ideally, truly international law would identify values that are common and shared across cultures and apply them to everyone equally. And such a system would help people to understand each other, to share best practices, and to actually feel like they're part of one community. And we do have general principles of law that are shared by all cultures, one of which is making reparations when you do harms. That's common to all legal systems in the world, and stopping those harms. So, we do have international law in some sense in the world, but the issue is more that the global North has never made reparations for its harms, from slavery to climate change, from settler colonialism to piracy, looting and plunder. Many of these harms are very much ongoing with no international legal responsibility or accountability, except, of course, when these things are done by states or peoples in the global South. So essentially, toilers uncovered these myriad dark sides of international laws and institutions. Yet we still believe that better international law is possible, which may seem somewhat of a paradox. Because whether we like it or not, law is one of the few tools that are available to the weak to control the actions of the strong. There's very little else in the world that can do that, whether internationally or domestically. So our world contains diverse philosophies of law, legal families, and legal systems. And so by allowing legal traditions from across the global south to inform international law, the discipline will be radically transformed. And this is already happening, and it is an ongoing process, an ongoing struggle. And domestically and regionally as well, it's the same thing. When those who are the objects of law, who are at the receiving end of the law and development project, in these law reform projects, when they can instead be the subjects and when they can participate in lawmaking, then there's the transformation of law towards justice rather than sort of predictable structural violence, which law also provides. Okay, so the relationship between law and development. So colonization produced this enduring asymmetrical power relationship between local legal systems and the legal systems of empire. And law was used not only to exploit the colonies, but also to civilize them. So this civilizing mission is the progenitor of the modern development industry. As with development, there's a tendency to treat global South legal systems as primitive and global North as advanced, and so development projects continually engage in this law reform from the former to the latter. And so I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour through the last 75 years of law development in just a few minutes. So in the 1950s, the law and development movement understood law as a key element of industrializing and modernizing the global South. So there was this mass transference of Western legal knowledge, institutions, and technologies. And Western trained lawyers were seen as social engineers. And it was this top-down approach focused on educating native lawyers. And this essentially continues with legal education across the global South today, which is still very much driven by the ideas and texts of old dead white men. So by the 1970s, Western lawyers were losing interest in reforming legal systems in the global South because it was really expensive and it hadn't really produced the economic development that it promised. So instead, at this time, economists started getting more interested in law, and they started focusing on the public and private legal institutions that would facilitate FDI. Foreign direct investment. So setting up predictable systems of private property, contracts, torts, corporate law, transparency, accountability, and enforceability in that particular area of life. Investment law, trade law, economic law. So only those that are necessary for economic exploitation. Outside of that, they were very tolerant of local legal and cultural traditions. By the time we get to the 1990s and the end of the Cold War, there was a surge of constitutional reform and bills of rights across many global South states. And on the international level, during this time, we have, as Pat has mentioned, in the global South, we had the new international economic order in the 1960s and 1970s to reform international economic and trade law, but this had failed. And there was this avalanche of debt crises across the global South in the 1980s. And so the global North has since then been engaging in lending with conditionalities, requiring legal systems across the global South to liberalize, deregulate and privatize. So throughout this whirlwind tour of law and development in the global South, inequality and environmental harms have actually not only not diminished, they've actually accelerated. So the only people who have continuously and consistently benefited through development through law reform are legal elites, domestic and international. So the end result is that through colonization and decolonization, European legal systems could violently alter understandings of time, space, of work, what is work, property, marriage, family, and so on, across the global South. So there was this very powerful form of politics because it has the power to control knowledge and representation in ways that are not easy to perceive, let alone transform. For instance, Western law has been able to transform a unified planet into discrete sovereign territories and turn the earth into exchangeable property and turn relationships into contracts, and turn time into money or money into free speech, or turn these interconnected ecosystems into just realms for infinite commodification and exchange. And law has even commodified human creativity and ingenuity. And so Western law has taken humans out of the ecosystems that keep us alive, legally alienating us from each other and from our lands. So movements like Trail and various Global South movements over time and space essentially strategically and tactically use law to resist the dominant legal ordering and to bring their own legal traditions into this international space. And this has had varying degrees of success and failure over time. So, for instance, we have here some international laws that originate in the Global South: the principle of self-determination, sovereign equality, non-intervention, the outlawing of apartheid and racial discrimination, the common heritage of humankind, the right to development, as Ramona discussed earlier, sustainable development, common but differentiated responsibilities for the global environment. So these are a few of what has emerged from this tactical engagement with international law. And then there are sort of ongoing efforts with regard to reparations for slavery, reparations for colonialism, reparations for climate loss and damage, the rights of so-called rights of nature, the rights of future generations, Pachamama, the Mother Earth conceptions, Ubuntu, Nakba, a concept of mass displacement and ethnic cleansing, Sumak Kause and Akinumaguen. So these are Sumak Kause is essentially a reimagining of what development means, and Akinumaguen is a reconception of what law means. Right? So there are all these, and this is just an example. There's more than this going on in the world. So as you can see, my point is essentially that law is a key terrain for contesting power. And by better understanding this terrain and its histories, we can sort of more fully and more knowledgeably engage in the politics of law today. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you for that insightful presentation, Yusha. International law, that perspective of the role of international law in development is very insightful, because just a few days ago, President Trump withdrew support to the ICC, because the decisions coming out of a particular course of action that the ICC is pursuing is inconsistent with Trump's and Bibi. So my inference is that we have the international laws, they're not applied consistently, and it depends on your military strength, depends on your economic background, and so on. So we see that third world countries of this global south, we are disadvantaged, but we still can use these laws to at least shame and highlight some of the injustices that's taking place. Thank you very much for your insight. So we're going to move now to Professor Don Marshall, Professor of International Political Economy, and he's also a University Director at SALISES, and he's going to speak for 15 minutes on decolonizing global governance agendas. Over to you, Prof. Marshall.
Okay. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting conversation. I hope to not cover ground already spoken, and I will just try to spur interest among those here by just focusing on some of the work, the research I'm doing, where it leads me to looking at this question of global governance and what it would mean to decolonize such. So let me do this, since I don't have a PowerPoint, let me do this in the form of sharing a story with you. There was a time I was engaging in some research about the role of international financial centers and why Caribbean countries and those of the Pacific were coming in for unusual critique and disparagement, as in the literature they were seen as facilitating fraud, engaging in calculated ambiguity. And I'm talking about those Caribbean international financial centers that offer non-resident clients a range of financial, legal, and management services. The common spiel that is utilized is to speak of the tax havens of the Caribbean, which is a disparagement, because this kind of activity takes place in a global geography of financial services, among a global geography of financial services providers. But those in London, Paris, Tokyo, Nevada, Ohio, Montreal, those in the South escape those kinds of negative predicates, where those of the South are always ascribed these special enclave labels, and treated as centers of intrigue when not centers of curiosity, centers of the curious. And it led me then to look at what I call colonial privileging, geographic privileging and deprivileging, part of a way in which practices being conducted in the area of the provision of financial services are deemed primitive, backward, mimicry when it comes from spaces like those of the Caribbean. But when it comes from so-called venerable spaces like London and so on, this is seen as sage financial advice. This is part and parcel of high finance and so on. So I found that a number of, and I've published a bit on speaking about what I call the colonial tropes abounding in the field of finance and financial studies. So this led me then invariably to question international financial governance, the language in use, the attempts to, by different centers, expert centers in the North, to arrogate to themselves the right to classify countries as compliant and non-compliant, to come up with classificatory schemes like gray lists, white lists, black lists. I hope the audience here can appreciate what I'm trying to capture here in the picture I'm painting here. It's part and parcel of a vexing agenda that Tax Justice Network pursues. That is to say, in the Tax Justice Network tries to expose what they believe to be corporations and high net worth individuals who, as it were, escape their tax obligations by engaging in arrangements with so-called financial services centers around the world. And they also focus on the role of transnational corporations in escaping tax obligations. And so in their zeal, this is Tax Justice Network, Caribbean and Pacific and other financial centers come in again for a special kind of shaming, naming and shaming. This is not the time or moment for me to get into the politics of all that. But I want to focus on through looking at examples of global governance I want to focus on origins and the exclusionary practices that abound. So let's take first international financial governance. And as I was hinting all along, Western officials tend to predominate in those important centers spawned from the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So whether we're talking about the Financial Action Task Force, or we're talking about similar kinds of bodies that exist within the United States and Britain, like financial crimes enforcement networks, and similar kinds of supranational bodies, Western officials dominate not only in terms of who people these organizations and these institutions, but also their norms, their considerations, their agenda. So tax evasion becomes an issue of high importance, but capital flight leaving countries of the South is not an important issue. The question of course, we know the question of tracing and tracking criminal monies, deviant monies, etc., remains a special concern. But this, what is peculiar, is that this is seen as, rather than as a problem that attends to the attends to the global geography of financial service provisioning. In other words, the entire gamut of international finance. This is instead seen as a challenge because countries of the South that are mimicking what venerable financial districts are doing in the North are really engaging in regulatory laxity and a race and therefore in a race to the bottom. And as it were, the colonial tropes come in where we are often subject to tutelage, subject to naming and shaming in blacklists, gray lists, etc. And it's a situation where we don't see London being blacklisted. We don't see New York being blacklisted, and all kinds of exclusionary practices abound. Officials coming from officials working within international financial centers located, say, in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, don't get to be included in the shaping of these rules, etc. So that's one classic example of where you see there's a need for decolonizing, because in relation to the governance, the power and authority rests with Western officials. The agenda rests with Western concerns, etc. And indeed, the literature, including knowledge produced about international financial centers, features a great deal of epistemic dishonesty. Let me put it like that. There is a tendency to treat the financial practices that obtains in the region as parenthetical to developments going on. It's perceived to be going on only in venerable spaces of the West. So that, for example, to speak about the financialization as a concept, quite often what takes place among those producing knowledge about financialization is to speak about the growth of modern finance through the discovery of, through the art of investment, portfolio theory, and so on and so forth, without so much of a backward glance at the role of early progenitors of modern finance that operated from out of the Caribbean from wider spaces in the Americas, in terms of the role that they played as warehousing capital during the slave trade, etc., etc. I want to skip that only because I recognize that time is short, and give another example of where there's a need for reform in global governance, particularly in the direction of decolonizing such and allowing for inclusion of officials and bodies drawn from the South. So I think what is currently in vogue, what I'm particularly interested in now, is to do the question of climate justice. So based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, climate justice has become a key reference in global climate governance negotiations under the umbrella of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in recent years. Yet, as climate change constitutes a perfect moral storm, it is vital to engage, I believe it's vital to engage with the contested meaning and use of climate justice and diverse ways of knowing in addressing the issue. In contrast to ideal theoretical understandings of climate justice, approaching the meaning and use acknowledges not only the inherently contested nature of climate-related norms, but also that their meanings evolve through interaction in context. This requires an understanding of the different contexts of global climate governance in which exclusionary practices unfold, such as over-reliance on academic and institutional knowledge, and the reproduction of existing orders of knowledge. Scholars have highlighted the relationship between climate policies and practices of distorting, marginalizing, or disregarding the ways of knowing and experiences of those most affected by climate change. Thus, my contribution here addresses the broader question of this webinar by focusing on the coloniality of knowledge at the nexus of academic knowledge production and policy formation, and proposing a decolonial approach that takes account of diverse ways of knowing about climate justice. Focusing on the meaning of climate justice is particularly revealing for three main reasons. One, the literature on climate justice and global climate governance still offers no more than a mere snapshot of important context to be considered, such as the development of ways of participating in existing climate regimes. This is of central significance, and we will agree, as climate change is a collective action problem in which disregarded actors continue to depend on the efforts of major greenhouse gas emitters and states as dominant actors to coordinate measures for decarbonization. I share the central concern about equity in decision-making for people who have been historically the least responsible for climate change and yet continue to bear the biggest burden of the consequences. Hence, it is essential for tackling climate change to ask who has access to negotiations and how participation is organized. Now, questions of justice become most visible in struggles over the distribution of resources and burden sharing, as well as in contention about who can participate in the creation of the rules of engagement in climate governance. I argue that, too, in order to analyze climate justice, more light has to be shed on the normative, epistemological, and ontological assumptions guiding the ways in which decision-making processes predominantly unfold in international politics. I argue that focusing on the dominant notions of climate justice, whose principles are often based on ideal theories in which the Westphalian state constitutes a central actor, tends to reproduce colonial structures, neglecting the lived experiences of people already affected by climate change. In this regard, Anibal Quijano has highlighted that, quote, the modes of knowing, of producing knowledge, of producing perspectives, images, and systems of images, unquote, constitute a crucial site of contention and a key dimension of coloniality. In light of current struggles in global climate governance, this underlies the necessity to analyze whose knowledge, concepts, and ways of knowing are recognized. Although climate justice is a ubiquitous term in global climate governance talks today, its emergence is the result of efforts by indigenous people, Black people, people of color, and environmental movements who have been central in identifying climate change as a global issue and calling for a just distribution of burdens to mitigate and adapt to the consequences. But notwithstanding this work, we found that the question of tackling climate change, coming up with adjustments, sees the exclusion of these indigenous organizations and these other civil society groups and organizations who have played a critical role in not only identifying climate change hazards and climate change developments, but they are also in the vanguard of engaging historically in climate resilient practices. So we have to find ways in which tackling the question of global governance in relation to climate change is decolonized and is more inclusive of other groups, other organizations, their thoughts and their framing. So there we have it in climate governance, in global financial governance, and recently in global health governance. We would have seen a situation where there was concern about coming up with ways in which to treat the crisis associated with COVID. But we saw in the height of that pandemic, we saw behavior by a number of powerful states of the global south to hoard vaccines, to refuse to accommodate waivers to the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS regime, that is, in order to allow for cheaper versions of the COVID-19 vaccines to be manufactured and produced out of the global south. We also saw a preference for securitization over solidarity in response to the pandemic. And again here, the colonial foundations of the framework for global health governance is one that has never taken the lives of people of the global south seriously. Certainly not as seriously as those of citizens of the West. And we see that there's a tendency of othering peoples of the global south, generating pathologies of suffering and vulnerabilities. And this constitutes part and parcel of what we witnessed during the COVID-19 arrangement. So in essence, in these three spheres of global governance, whether we're talking about health, finance, international financial governance, that is, and when we're talking about global health governance, the exclusionary practices persist, the bias of the West persists, the bias of the knowledge produced by the West persists, and well, I would want to conclude by saying that we shouldn't really be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised if we remember what Fanon has had to say about epistemic violence, what he's had to warn about European epistemic insights, and how the colonial project was enacted. And bear with me, Fanon had reminded that the violence is located in the prevailing European epistemic insights about the state of nature, justifying therefrom dispossession via legal precepts, encouraging the freedom to explore, the freedom to settle, the freedom to proselytize, and to trade. And for Caribbean islands, claim for European imperial rule, those logics, that is to say, those logics that spoke to a freedom to explore, a freedom to settle, a freedom to proselytize, and a freedom to trade, led to the disregard of ecosystem practices among indigenous populations that sustain livelihoods for entire communities of Garifuna, Caninagro, and Tainos people. And the consequent enactment of chattel slavery and the socio-political organization of the plantation as a central mode of accumulation, all of that constituted a sort of origins in the settling of what would eventually be the current an existing world order. So, I mean, we should not really be surprised to see the vestigial effects of racism, settler colonialism, native genocide, underlying the economic, racial, environmental, and climate injustices we see today. I want to stop at this point because I've done a broad sweep here and I've tried to make connections here and there, so bear with me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you for that insight and that conceptual framework across these three governance issues, okay? International finance, the post-1945 world, United States came out as the dominant player in global finance. You know, the payment system is controlled by the US. You know, they use the SWIFT payment system as a weapon against countries that they are not, friends with or allies against their allies. And just recently, I observed that the US pulled out of the WHO, which the US substantially contributes to WHO financing. So, that's an issue that, we have to contend with. And the US also pulled out of the Paris Agreement, so those are some issues that are really important to global South. We expect global health. Okay, it's the WHO that really help developing countries like ours in the Caribbean, control all these diseases that we are facing. And when the US pull out as the major contributor, that's really a concern. Okay, so thank you for those for highlighting those issues, Don. So our next speaker is Prof. Rosalie Hamilton, and she's gonna speak on navigating global change, strengthening the people's voice. Prof. Hamilton is a social scientist and advocate for sustainable development that improve the environment, economy, society, and governance. And recently, she was vice president at UTech, University of Technology, and was awarded a professorship in the Scotiabank Chair in Entrepreneurship and Development. Prof. Hamilton, you have 15 minutes to speak on navigating global change, strengthening the people's voice. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let me jump right in. Going to be talking about navigating global changes. I'm highlighting the importance of strengthening the voice of people, empowering people to really foster the kind of development that can help us to navigate the changes. And I thought I'd just give a quick overview of the perspective I'll be using, more of a proactive type of approach rather than a reactive approach. I also want to suggest that a proactive approach is going to pretty much ensure that we focus on ourselves, focus on a self-reliant path. And here, self-reliant development is really about the economic, social, political progress that we absolutely must focus on, relying on our local capabilities and resources, and not so much relying mainly on external aid, foreign investment, external influences as we have had in the past. And I think this kind of focus gets us to the sustainability issues and linking all of these development issues that we're talking about to the lives of people. And so I want to point to constitutional reform as an important part of the strategy. Jamaica, as many of you know, are in the throes of a major constitutional reform process. So I'm going to highlight that and talk about the importance of those kinds of reform changes that address the empowerment of people and communities and ensuring that they have a voice in this process. So, when we're talking about these global changes, we're really talking about changes that are determined by social, economic, environmental, technical factors, yeah? And the agendas, these priorities that influence the majority of countries in the world, address these issues, whether it's trade, development issues, the finance that we just heard about, social issues, health, human rights, environment, and so on. And all of those are driven by state actors, but non-state actors as well, and these international organizations. And this is the kind of headwind or the context in which we are tackling with these changes. So for me, these major global ripple effects that we're seeing from the Trumpian approach to things is really just the most recent example of these changes in the world that are driven by people who are actively seeking to pursue wealth creation and economic advances. And we've seen historically that there are winners and losers in this process of global interaction. And we have been there before. Jamaica and the Caribbean, we've had a 500-year agenda of global influences, whether in the form of whether in terms of our impact, it has led to the genocide, slavery, colonization, and so on. And all of that tells me that what we're seeing now is just another episode, cyclical kind of experience that we're having. And so I think for us to think about how we navigate these agendas, we ought not to think about what is happening to us as if we are non-players in this global dynamic, right? It's not just about how we respond to what people are doing to us and whether we align with certain people or resist and so on. I see these as reactive strategies, and I do think a more proactive strategy through the lens of what we are doing in the world to make our way, to achieve our objectives. And in so doing, how do we influence these global changes? And our capacity to influence these global changes are obvious. We do it in our music and in all kinds of spheres, sports, athletics, and so on. And of course, in the sciences, we're there as well. Arthur Lewis is a good example of shaping global thinking about economics. And so I think the challenge for us is, how do we develop our economy and society on self-reliant terms? How do we strengthen our capacity to compete and win in a global market in which there are winners and losers? How do we reduce our import dependence? How do we deal with these historic inequalities that we've just heard are getting worse? And ultimately, how do we lift the standard of living of our people? That's the reason a lot of us end up in the West and now facing all of these immigration issues. When we think about our standard of living, and here I'm focusing on Jamaica standard of living, 2023, we're talking about real GDP per capita of about $5,000 US. And this is lower than it was in 4 different years in the past, from 1972, imagine. The standard of living was higher then, 2006, 2007, 2008. And when we think about this is 10 times lower than the typical OECD country. Now, that's important as a benchmark. And again, very aggregative, and I'm not suggesting here that we're trying to look like and develop in ways that the West have, but in terms of just a measure of how we live. Our goal as a country in our Vision 2030 is to achieve this status. And so if we're going to try to get to that kind of standard of living where each of us can earn anything close to $50,000 US, then we have to address these root causes as to why we've persistently seen low standard of living. And we will compare ourselves to the Caribbean, to small island states, you see that we're still worse off than the average. And so when we think about what we need to do to accelerate the achievements of these targets, some of us don't think we'll get there, but even if we can get closer to those targets, then key constitutional changes, I think, can accelerate the process. Now, if we think about our economic problem as fundamentally undercapitalization of our economy, rooted in the extent to which we literally are unable to provide the kinds of capital assets to fully absorb the resources and so on that we have. We've been able to look at the evidence that we've seen over 123 countries. And what we see is we have to raise the standard of living. And this is kind of what we've been able to pick up across these countries, where countries that devote their resources simultaneously around building the capacity to produce and export capital goods and services, engage in that global competition on terms where we have produced goods and services, capital goods and services that dominate our GDP. And we do it in the context of upgrading institutions that provide the skill sets that we need, that provides the innovation that we need, and so on. When we look especially at our educational institutions, we repeatedly every year see the challenges of the extent to which we're producing kids with less, with the below the standards required to effectively make their way in the world. And so we see persistent low skill levels, low productivity levels, the institution incapable of fostering the kind of creativity and innovation that we have and we display in many ways, but not in a sense that we can benefit ultimately from it in terms of lifting standard of living. And of course, the kind of conformist behavior that we've inherited that stifles the creativity and low esteem that we absolutely need if we want to go bold in creating out-of-the-box solutions to the problems. We need education institutions that ultimately can help us there. And so when we think about it those ways, we have to ask ourselves, if we're able to do that, then we can, in fact, better deal with the kind of external shocks that we're now seeing coming from what is happening in the world, whether it's the fall in remittances that we're going to be facing, the dramatic withdrawal of USAID and its implications, the impacts on incomes, etc. All of that, I think we have to ask ourselves two questions. Do we really perpetuate what we currently have, which is a kind of externally propelled development that we've seen historically have not improved the standard of living of the average Jamaican? These are questions we have to ask here in Jamaica. Or do we build a self-reliant economy that is more internally propelled, capable of lifting the standard of living of the average Jamaican? Those are the key questions I want us to think through, because I think ultimately that will determine how we respond to the rest of the world. Some of us think that we can do what we're doing better, and some of us think we have to really rethink this. And in so doing, the constitutional and legal framework to support this becomes very, very important. As I said, we're in the throes in Jamaica in a constitutional reform process, and I suggest that our current constitutional arrangement, as well as the constitutional amendment Republic Bill that was tabled in Parliament in December last year, cannot support the kind of self-reliant development that we're talking about. And I want to just highlight two key flaws that are embedded in the institution and designed as part of what we currently have in our constitutional arrangement. The concentration of power in the cabinet and the prime minister, and no adequate oversight for, and that should be inadequate oversight for provisions for oversight. And here, what we've experienced is really the domination of our voices, our representatives in the legislature by the executive. And so we see decisions that are executive-led. We don't see the legislature being able to shape and provide the kinds of oversight that's required. Recently, we saw trillions of dollars that are not properly reported, accounted for. That only happens if there is not adequate oversight on an annual basis. And we've seen that this kind of top-down approach to governance have fostered a kind of authoritarian, dictatorial approach, and in many ways, undemocratic governance that is a feature of the arrangements we have in place. The second major flaw is the weakness in the mechanisms to empower people. And it's important to reflect on the idea that the Constitution was never designed to empower the people. And the earlier presentation by Ramona about the extent to which the law has enabled and facilitated the kinds of economic experiences we've had in the past is real. It is the constitutional arrangement that we had in place during the colonial era that we took with very little changes into the independence era. And while we've made some changes around the Bill of Rights, we, in terms of that, those provisions there in Chapter 3, with respect to the structure of government that we've inherited, we've not seen any significant changes. And I suggest that unless we look at it in terms of the broad structural arrangement, not just for central government, but for local government, we will perpetuate the kinds of arrangement we have. So I think that if we address these flaws, we are going to enhance our capacity to better achieve self-reliant development. And I want to just drill down to say that the current arrangement we have and the bill that's tabled now cannot ensure that the will of the people is expressed in the lawmaking process. Again, the point about the dominance and the domination of the Prime Minister's will and the Cabinet's will in the legislature. The inadequate oversight is an issue. We have to ensure that there is adequate oversight by the non-executive members of the legislature to make sure that there's a transparency and accountability that we want our representatives to ensure on our behalf. With respect to participatory governance, I think that's also constrained by the arrangement we have. The idea of dealing with the inequities that we see in the system, the access to opportunities, wealth, creation, power and so on. We're seeing the uneven development in parishes and in communities across the country. That has to be addressed. And with respect to the rights of communities to pursue self-reliance and ensure that they can develop their communities on a self-reliant term, the arrangements are not in place for that. And certainly with respect to equitable justice for all, we still go to the Privy Council in the UK, and that's an issue. And ultimately, we need these kinds of arrangements that enable us to, for example, petition or legislation. So these are just specific things that we now are unable to do, and we have to put different arrangements in place. And so for me, the move to establish this Jamaican Republic must focus on achieving people's sovereignty and redesigning the Constitution in ways to address these core flaws. Now, there's a lot of focus on removing the monarch. That should have been done from 1962. And there's a lot of debate about whether we appoint and elect a local head of state. I suggest that all of that discussion does not get us to a constitutional framework that can facilitate self-reliant development. And that's an important lens because that's what people want. In fact, throughout this conversation, people keep saying, well, how is all these constitutional changes, how will it affect our lives? What will be different? And so when I look at these reforms, I suggest that we have to think about restructuring the parliament, ensuring there's adequate oversight, strengthening the voice of the people with respect to the rights to petition, and democratizing the Senate, looking again at the way we create a Senate through appointments rather than elections, and ensuring that they're also given the work to address the needs of people in communities. Also, restructuring communities and the local government, defining local communities in terms of their rights, empowering communities to influence the decisions that impact them directly, ensuring that communities can act entrepreneurially, They can become entrepreneurs, get involved in local government themselves, collectively, cooperatively, and also to ensure that they can support the entrepreneurial developments in local communities. And in that context, rethinking our approach to local government so that it can function more as a network of these empowered local communities that are empowered with rights and responsibilities. Now, these are grand ideas, but how does it really relate to rural people in communities across our country? And I want to drill down now to how these kinds of changes can improve the lives of Jamaicans. There's a recent report which was on the television just Sunday here in Jamaica of the community of Craig Hill. In December last year, there was a bridge that collapsed. Now, from 2018, there were some issues with that bridge, and it was closed for safety reasons. But in December last year, it actually collapsed. And these are just some screenshots from the TV reporting that I saw. And so the residents are now left with, how do we get from one side of the bridge to the other? Do we literally climb on the bridge? If you look good, you see people climbing on the bridge that is broken. Or do we wade across the water and run the risk that we'll be swept away? These images really got my attention as I watched the newscast. A young woman is being helped across on that ledge, and a man takes a child on his back to cross that broken down bridge. And the Member of Parliament announced that the bridge will be in the 2025 to 2026 budget. That was the report. And so the people in this community from 2018 at least have been complaining about this problem. It collapsed. The bridge that they used to be able to walk over, no car should have gone, the truck should not have gone, it collapsed, and that's where they are. How could constitutional reform and related legislation help people in these communities? And I'm going to suggest how. I think first we have to be clear what we mean by communities. We have a constitutional amendment, Local Government Act from 2015, and it provides that local communities should be assisted to participate in local government. But who are these communities? How are they defined? The people in communities define themselves differently than, say, the organizations responsible for these communities, the SDC. And so that's an issue of how we clarify not just the communities, but the power they have to act. We have to empower them with rights and responsibilities. That, in essence, is what it means to pursue self-reliant solutions, to enable people in these communities to achieve self-determination. And I suggest that the rights must enable these communities to mitigate the impact of climate changes. This bridge is worsened every year, and all of these infrastructures are worsened every year due to climate change. And we don't have an arrangement in place where communities can effectively protect themselves without relying on whether it is a municipality that is inaccessible to some people in rural communities or central government located in Kingston. And so whether the rights involve things like ensuring that you have a body that is of elected representatives of the communities that can help to address the community development problem, whether they have a fair share of the national budget to address their needs, whether they can be organized as an empowered community with assets, land, and other assets that are under their control in collaboration with their municipality and of course the national government, but able to support the businesses to lift their capacity to find entrepreneurial solutions, just to the bridge or any alternative route, but to create joint ventures with entrepreneurs in the diaspora. There's a lot of diaspora flow that comes into these communities that can help in ways that are limited now by the way we structure central and local government. And the capacity to petition and provide the kind of information to the legislatures with respect to the problems that they're facing and the solutions they need. And I suggest that their capacity to solicit an elected Senate that's empowered with being able to influence the capital development budget, ensuring that each community, each parish have some fair share of that national capital development budget would be important. And of course, have arming individuals and groups with the right to petition. And there would be enhanced capacity for oversight in an arrangement that we reconfigure such that the execution of these solutions, the building of the bridge and so on, can be done in a transparent way so that we don't see the kinds of losses that we've seen on major projects like that. Is this possible? Well, I suggest that if we really empower our people and community, it is. If we can address the design flaws that I mentioned, empower people to address issues of, just to strengthen their representative democracy that we have, to improve accountability, etc. Strengthen the rights and freedoms of individuals, facilitate joint decision making. If we do all of that, I think it will help to improve people's capacity to address these global changes. We have stronger communities who are able to build the resilience required to deal with global shocks, etc. So it is in that context, I suggest that some of the key mechanisms to empower people and strengthen our voices have to do with the constitutional reforms that we can put in place to give people the right to petition and to empower communities with rights that can enable and foster entrepreneurship. And of course, public education is key here, capacity building, ensuring that people understand their role in the development process, in building a representative democracy. And of course, we have to navigate all of the AI issues. I know the next presentation is going to speak to that, but all of that has to be managed as we engage, publicly engage our people with respect to rights and responsibilities. Let me just end on this note. I know that Marcus Garvey, our national hero, who was just pardoned, and many of us are happy to see that development. And of course, we're looking for full exoneration. He spent his life talking about self-reliance. So I just thought I'd end on this quote from Marcus Garvey: "Chance has never yet satisfied the hope of a suffering people. Self-reliance, the vision of self and the future have been the only means by which the oppressed have seen and realized the light of their own freedom." Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Hamilton, for highlighting some of the issues in Jamaica that we need to address. But we still have to be optimistic. From about 2013, Jamaica was almost at the brink, given our financial, a massive financial shock, given our debt to GDP ratio of about 100% of our national income. Yet today, we're about hovering about 70% national debt is about national debt. The overall debt is about 70% for national income, and that was a consensus between the citizenry and our political leaders. So we still there is that possibility of forming a national coalition, to address some of the things that we need to address. We need just some political will. But the citizen, we have made massive sacrifice. Okay, we took our salary frozen for a number of years so that we are in a better position today. Okay, so I'm optimistic, but there's much more need to be done, and it's important that we continue to highlight some of the things that we need to do. Okay, so I thank you for that presentation. Our next presentation is by our own director at SALISES Mona, Professor Lloyd Waller, and he's going to speak on Caribbean technology, decolonization, and artificial and the transformation of artificial intelligence for development. You're going to speak for about 15 minutes, and following that, your presentation, we're going to open the floor for questions and answers. So it's over to you, Prof. Waller.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Hi, everyone. My name is Lloyd Waller. I'm the director for SALISES. Just a quick background, these topics are something that I'm familiar with. I have a master's in development studies from the Department of Sociology, and I'm a big technology person. So, when I got this invitation from Pat, and I had to think about, what to speak about. It wasn't that difficult, given the connection between colonization, technology, the work of Frank and even Gervon. So today I wanted to highlight some of the shifts in technology over the last couple of years. And then I want to talk about AI and the different types of AI. I want to also discuss the possible democratic and empowering nature of AI, and then to move on to looking at the localized AI, indigenized AI as a solution for decolonization. And I want to look at the challenges for this particular solution and some mitigation strategies that can be used to address some of these challenges. 1 second, let me just move this down. So, historically, the literature on technology for development essentially highlights and draws attention to several development theories, ranging from the early Adam Smith that saw the Home Office introducing technologies such as steam engines and mechanizations to the different colonies around the world, to modernization theories by Rostow. I think Pat spoke about that earlier. So, many of these theories that have emerged alongside the evolution of different technologies across the different industrial revolutions. Over time, these theories found themselves into different development imperatives and policies driven by foreign, bilateral, multilateral, transnational actors with a promise of development. In this very same way in which they're doing now with artificial intelligence as it relates to achieving some aspects of development. A number of international organizations are already including AI for development as a part of their global development imperative. Now, the truth is, although there is no denying that technology or the technologies for the last 3 industrial revolutions, steam engines, the tractors, computers, we can't deny that they have added values to the lives of the people in the developing world. The total promise of development has still, through technology, has never been fully realized. And then there are some, such as Gardner Frank, who has, is it my screen is okay. And there are some such as Gardner Frank, who has generally been concerned about this promise of development through the use of technology. And there's an entire body of literature that talks about a kind of technological colonialization, where this connection between, or this use of foreign technology encourages a kind of technological dependence. It facilitates the economic power that is concentrated in those in the country who can understand and can afford the technology, but at the same time, these persons who Gardner Frank termed the comprador elites are tied to first world countries as well, who work together to generate wealth for themselves, but it's not necessarily shared to the developing country that they operate in. And very often, many of these technologies that are dumped on the developing worlds are sometimes defective, sometimes old, in some instances, but at the end of the day, and has been defined as inappropriate technology. Sometimes they don't actually achieve the exact goals that we want them for development, but they do achieve the goals that the persons who sell them to us want in terms of generating incomes for themselves. But at the end of the day, this technological colonialism, colonization or colonialism has stifled local innovation. A couple of years ago, I did a study speaking to tech firms in Jamaica because I wanted to understand why is it that we don't have a Google, why we don't have an Amazon. I mean, we know we have assumptions, but it was quite interesting that one of the things that I found was that there was a dependence on using off-the-shelf applications that one can edit or modify rather than developing local technology or using open source technology. But so nevertheless, even with ICTs, there was still that sense of development and that sense of underdevelopment as it relates to not developing our own technological solutions, which is a problem that we're being facing for a while. Now, it is argued, and it's possible to argue, that AI, based on its nature, is a different type of technology that can contribute to the development project as it relates to the promise of development through technology. I'm not advocating that AI is a magic bullet, because it's certainly not a magic bullet, but it does have some properties that can significantly contribute to advancing the development agenda here in the Caribbean, and contribute also to a kind of decolonial development project that we can undertake. And I'll explain it shortly, but I just want to go through some, AI. So the generative AI is the AI that we mostly use. This is the Chat GPT, this is the DALL-E, this is the Midjourney. These are the AIs that can provide text, videos, and audios. And there are other types of AI as well. There is narrow AI, which like Siri on your mobile phone is designed to do one particular task when you ask it to do so. There is also reactive and limited AI, which it provide only inputs that one can use to learn from memory about different experiences, like IBM Deep Blue, for example, and facial recognition software. And you also have limited AI, which learns from past data. ChatGPT and chatbots can be defined as that. But you have a lot of theoretical AI that I'm not going to go into. But the things that make people fear AI as it relates to stories about, AI is taking over, the Hollywood popular culture version of how evil AI is still a theoretical construct, to be quite frank. That is generative AI, super AI, theory of mind AI. And yes, there's some exploration into making these a reality, but as far as I'm concerned, and as much as I know, we're not there as yet. So, this fear about what AI can and can't do, it's really theoretical, to be quite frank. So I'm just focusing on the first one, which is really the popular one, which is generative AI. Now, earlier I spoke about the nature of AI, and when I talk about the nature of AI, I have 8 propositions that talk about the nature of AI. It's scalable. One can use ChatGPT as an individual, but one can use ChatGPT as an entire company. I went to a popular international organization a couple of weeks ago, and and every desk that you walked past, everyone had ChatGPT open, and people even had books about how to write prompts. It's more adaptable. It's easily flexible. One can. It learns, and it improves, and unlike the technologies of before where you had to call, write, or send for an expert to help you, it's more adaptable. You can do it yourself. It's more accessible. It's free for some. You have to pay for the more advanced version, but even the basic versions that you don't have to pay for are still powerful and can achieve many different livelihood and social related goals. It has massive data processing capabilities. It can be integrated into many different technologies. We're already seeing it on the phones, on the cars, in the houses, on people's watches. I have a pair of glasses that is strictly driven by AI. Even this one that I have on here now, I can easily get access to both ChatGPT and Amazon Alexa by just pressing a button right under my glasses here. So it's everywhere basically. And when you compare that the colonial types of technology with the post-colonial type of technology, AI, first 1, 2, 3, industrial revolution, and 4, 5, which is 4 bordering on 5, you can see the difference in terms of what I just spoke about as it relates to economic control, whether or not it's appropriate. The slides will be available after the presentation, but you see the fact that AI can be said to be far different than the previous technologies. It stands out from early industrial revolutions on these different spectrum, and unlike past revolutions that centralized powers like in factories and corporations, AI has the potential to empower individuals, enabling creative automation and access to knowledge like never before. And again, I'm saying all of this with still a recognition that it is not a magic bullet, because there are a couple of caveats that we can speak about later. So it's possible to argue that artificial intelligence offers a pathway to help dismantle the legacy of colonialism by providing tools that can empower previously marginalized communities, reshape knowledge, change existing power struggles across the world. But I think one of the key questions I have to ask myself each time I see the value and the value proposition of AI in this regard is, will AI empower everyone, or will it repeat history and concentrate power? Can discuss. I think the answer could lie in number 8 here, which is the fact that AI is more customizable, more more indigenizable than other types of technologies. And here we're talking about a concept that is called AI localization. Now, technological indigenization refers to, what I spoke about earlier, refers to a process by which a society, a community, a country can adapt and easily integrate foreign technology to fit its local contexts and its local needs. And the concept is usually discussed in the context of development, and particularly how developed countries absorb, modify, and develop more advanced technologies. More recent conversation, the fusion theory is the most recent representation of that kind of conversation, to be quite frank. Localized AI, which is what indigenizing AI refers to, is the development and the application of AI that are specifically designed to adapt to meet distinct environmental, socioeconomic circumstances and outcomes. And for this particular reason, that one can easily use AI in that kind of democratic, empowering sense. AI has the potential to play a crucial role in decolonizing the Caribbean by supporting indigenization and localization. And this process can help to, and it has already started in other parts of the world, in New Zealand with the Maoris, in Australia with Aborigines, even in northern Canada with the Inuits, where we're seeing AI being used to reclaim cultural narratives, empower local economies, allowing micro and small businesses to scale with medium and large foreign businesses within particular country. And more importantly, it helps to reduce the dependence, not eliminate, but helps to reduce the dependence on external systems that are generally rooted in our colonial past, to be quite frank. And these are, and going through the literature, these are just some of the ways in which I'm seeing where AI is helping with this kind of decolonial project as it relates to preservation of language. AI-powered translation and speech recognition software has been used and is being used now to preserve language. As a matter of fact, if you can speak to ChatGPT in Patois, and it responds to both the text, audio, Patois itself. We have been preoccupied in Jamaica trying to map the patois language, and they within a week, a Jamaican working, if you Google it, the story is somewhere on the internet, working in ChatGPT, in OpenAI, told the AI to pull as much information you can from around the world and map out the Jamaican patois. So if you can speak to ChatGPT patois, you can tell it that for the next 10-20 minutes, next hour, I want to speak to you in patois. It's phenomenal. AI can reconstruct Caribbean history by even analyzing colonial archives. We have a lot of data even in SALISES that we can look at. Analyzing the archives, correcting whatever biases exist, and amplifying local perspectives. I mean, to be quite frank, the uses, Pat, are limitless. I've seen where AI has been used to reclaim indigenous aesthetics that were erased by colonialism. AI assisted music production. I've seen it empower artists by promoting local rhythms and instruments in Africa, kept in Ghana in particular. I've seen where it has been used to assist public policy that can help in terms of looking at the long-term impact of cultures, and this was the Maori situation. So there are many different factors. There are many different ways in which AI can contribute to the decolonization project. However, it is important to also recognize that there are a lot of challenges to realizing these goals. The first one is fear. Most persons that I speak to see AI as something that is complicated when it is not. If you can use Google, you can use any one of the AI modules. They were created for that particular reason, the simplicity of it. Many persons, without even touching AI, automatically assume that it is complicated and one cannot understand it. And speaking to someone, and she immediately said to me, I don't want to go there because it's difficult to understand. And I asked, have you ever tried? And she said no. And she's using legacy memory from thinking that AI means programming, or being influenced by popular culture, which has always articulated AI as something that is complicated and complex. So that childhood trauma seems to be something that we need to get over. Perhaps we need to see a psychiatrist in that particular regard. And then there's a concern about the programming language. The AIs, they are programmed by Western programmers. So they come with some preconceived notions already. Open source applications and even OpenAI has some solutions where that is concerned to bypass that specific challenge. But it is important for persons to recognize that AIs do themselves come with a particular coding language and a coding and an understanding of reality that is located in the algorithm that exists. There are data gap issues sometimes when you use the AI. There are some data gap issues. At SALISES, we're trying to digitize a lot of the data that we have, because the data gap issues can also be as a result of the inability for these algorithms to be able to access the data in the first place. So it's always encouraged that persons who have archival records make the archival records available, so that when the AIs are searching to build whatever logic model that they're building, they have a very holistic picture of the situation. And of course, we have the big issue, which is the privacy and ethical concerns. Where are you pulling the data from? Is the AI an exploiter now? Are you taking Caribbean knowledge and empowering other persons? And of course, people would argue and say otherwise, that you're also taking. Also there's this reciprocal mechanism where you can also get access to our knowledge. So it's really shared. So I'm basically saying that there are a lot of issues, unexplored issues, that one can examine in terms of looking at the role of AI in not just dealing with post-colonial issues or decolonialism or decolonization related issues, but many of the challenges that we have had, that we've been struggling and battling with in the Caribbean, in the global South for the last, 30, 40 years, collaboration with AI companies, utilizing the tools themselves, taking advantage of the knowledge that can be created by it, taking advantage of the how it can move from text to images and from images to text in a world where content has to be packaged in a particular way for people to receive it in goodwill. And it can also solve that particular gap. We as academics, we as intellectuals, we speak to ourselves for the most part. I've used AI to tone down, translate from my articulations, and I said it, so that even a 5-year-old can understand. And that sent out into the universe. And I've been engaged by persons who say, saw it. It was like it was text converted to video on Midjourney, uploaded to a TikTok account, and people reach out. Wasn't even expecting persons to reach out on that particular topic, but persons reached out to engage because it wasn't something that they needed to read. It's just a 2-minute thing on TikTok that they could watch, that they felt interested in, that they reached out to say, can we get more information? So for the first time, AI has that, or this technology has that potential to empower even us as academics, as scholars, as those who study these things and would want to normalize, popularize, or get more persons involved in advocacy kinds of work, or raise that kind of knowledge base about circumstances that persons are in that they don't know, empowerment, transformation. AI has the potential to empower persons to be able to achieve that particular goal. And, it's important that we try to overcome some of the challenges associated with achieving such goal, investing more in local AI research and innovation. I'm not seeing it being done in the Caribbean. I'm seeing it elsewhere. Develop AI policies that prioritize decolonization. I'm seeing it happening, but what I'm seeing happening was not the intention. It is happening, but that was not necessarily the intention. So one can only imagine, with an intention to do so, how widespread and how expansive and how solutions oriented something like that can be. Build AI models that use Caribbean-specific data. We're now doing that at SALISES. Hopefully the project should be finished by the end of the year, so everyone will have access to that. Train and retain local AI talent. We are trying, I'm seeing different Caribbean countries recognizing the importance of AI now, but we still have a challenge as it relates to being able to pay persons in IT to stay here in the Caribbean. Most of them want to go to Canada. The opportunities are much better. Other things happening now, but nevertheless, it's very important to recognize the importance of investing in this kind of talent. It does not make any sense that a colleague of mine can tell me that one of our students is now working at Meta and is now making significant strides at Meta, when that person could have been here creating a Meta for the Caribbean. And it's also important to kind of advocate some form of digital sovereignty, recognizing that reducing any form of dependency, and strengthening the Caribbean infrastructure to ensure that things such as data centers and cloud computing and AI resources are locally managed, and we don't have to be dependent on these post-colonial systems to manage our own data. So it's not that AI is a magic bullet. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just simply saying that, unlike the other technologies that had promised development that were articulated as magic bullets, as far as up to 2001, the ICT for development pushed by the World Bank and the IMF and the World Bank and UNDP. But I am saying that, unlike the previous technologies of the first 3 industrial revolution, AI offers generative AI, I should say, offers opportunities for us to engage the decolonization project in a very easy way. As it relates to the future, when we move from the AIs that we're using now to the more advanced AIs, that the ones that we're afraid of, it may change the dynamics altogether. It's quite an interesting kind of conversation now, because we have the West. If we're at that stage, and I'm leaving you with this, if we are at that stage with artificial general intelligence, not generative AI, it will be us in the West, us in the global South, them in the North or the West, and the AIs elsewhere. So, and I probably only think about it, as I said, in the future, because it will be quite an interesting dynamic, because artificial general intelligence would mean that it would be a sentient being, separate and apart, that will not be restricted by the coding and the algorithms that the West creates for it, because it will create its own code and create its own AI. The AI will create its own AI based on the parameters that it set, which will be quite an interesting world that we're going to be living once that starts to happen, if it has not already started. Thank you very much, everyone. I think you muted, Kevin. Kevin, you muted.
Okay, yeah, all right. Yeah, thank you very much. Government's role in AI is, the productivity, the promise of productivity. So that's what we're looking for from AI, whether it can stimulate productivity, and there's a lot of discussion around that. Okay, so thank you for your broad sweep of the importance of AI, and that we should embrace AI rather than turning away from AI. Okay, all right. So at this point, we're going to open the floor for questions and answers. So you can use the raise on feature, and I'll just acknowledge you. Okay. So our first question comes from Julia. So just open your mic.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. I thank all the speakers. A very interesting slide of discussions. But so I'm starting with the last one. So I listened to Mr. Professor.
Biholar, yeah.
Biholar, right. And I also heard the other speakers, Dr. Northover, Ms. Hamilton, etc. And but I'm just thinking that I agree fully that AI is AI and digital is the way forward, because we cannot go back to learning from scratch in terms of the industrial revolutions. But my concern is that I think somebody mentioned the lived experience, that we need to consider the realities that policies and institutions are developed and created based on some developed countries' concept of what is right. And the KPIs that they use, the criteria for success, is based on what they perceive is happening in the smaller countries and developing countries. And that's a big problem, because how they perceive that we can measure something, we maybe are so far away, or it's not within our realm and it's not practical, or they take data from which is not reality in the country. So the lived experience is important. So the question about is really about AI, and how can we ensure that the common man uses AI, because he's not necessarily afraid, but we assume that they can just use it. It's not so. It is just a common. It's not they're afraid of it. It's just that we have to bring them to the point where they understand that Siri and those things are AI. And then how do you create a group of persons in Jamaica who can create their own, that's what is algorithm, to create their own generative AI, to build an AI? Because unless we can do that, and then we can speak it, but in terms of it causing the groundswell, it just won't happen, because we're assuming that it's an automatic process. So what do we do about that?
All right,
Sorry,
so
so long.
no problem. So let me just answer first the first one. You ask, how do we get AI in the hands of the common man? Well, it's already there, and you're right. We need to let them know that ChatGPT now uses AI, and there is in the search bar, if you just go and type in anything, what's the cost, what's the distance between Jamaica and Kingston and Florida, it pops up there. So it's already there. It's already in Siri. It's already on your mobile phones in most applications. I think it is just for them to the usual social awareness programs that would need to be integrated in current community-related projects through different government agencies that go into communities, that engage communities, to just let persons be aware that the same mobile phones that they use to make phone calls, the same WhatsApp that they use to make whatever exchange, trade pictures or whatever, they can also use it to get information for their business. And I've seen where persons are using it already for their business. So for example, I went to a particular area in Jamaica that sells fish, and I had to engage with some fishermen, and I noticed that they were using ChatGPT. Rather than even using a calculator, they were using ChatGPT and also the WhatsApp AI to communicate. So it is there, and social awareness programs can help to bring it there. The second question is, how do we get a group of persons from the government to go around? It doesn't need to be the government, to be quite frank. It can also be the University of the West Indies. I mean, when I was head of the Department of Government, there was a recognition that we did not have a civics program in Jamaica, and I thought it was a concern because a lot of students that came to the department didn't know much about issues of governance. So we launched the Governance Society, which are a group of young persons with knowledge of governance that go into high schools and primary schools and raise awareness about good governance. And we allowed the students to create their own programs, so they were able to connect with their younger colleagues. So churches can do it, the government can do it, civil society, but I know a number of international organizations are already starting that kind of awareness program, that kind of training program. And I have noticed in the last 4 months in particular, there are a lot of civil society and government agencies that are offering AI courses from Udemy and Coursera. So it has already started, to be quite frank. And even you can play a particular role in your community in terms of engaging persons in your community to utilize these technologies for their own personal livelihood development. So it's there, it's easy, it's simple, it's on the phone. It's like searching on Gmail. I know I don't want to minimize it and make it seem that simple, but the truth is it is much simpler than actually writing a code in an application to get a particular outcome. Someone has done that for you before. It's just for you to punch that information in.
Great. Our next, Lockhart, you want to go ahead and open your mic?
Hi, good day.
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yes, go ahead. I'm hearing you. Go ahead and ask the question.
Okay, so I got into the conversation a bit late, but I did listen to Professor Hamilton and our last speaker, Waller.
Yeah, Prof. Waller.
So I have 2 questions. First, for Professor Hamilton, excellent presentation. A lot of stuff that you raised. So these are issues that I would raise within my circle, but in terms of getting to the point where there is change. Now, I'm in Ghana right now, and our political systems are, top down, winner takes all setup. So that participative democracy we don't really see. Do you have, what should I say, any guidelines or pointers in how do we reach that point where there is that greater participation? Because as it stands right now, this is my perception, the political establishment actually benefits from this top-down approach where they wield all the power and the population is just beholden to them. Where do you see the change coming? Do you think there is space for grassroots movements to actually, bring about that change, or is it we're a situation where we just have to hope and that our politicians actually get the message and realize that, you know, we can't accomplish development until certain changes are made, as you mentioned, especially constitutional changes? That's the question for Professor Professor Hamilton, sorry. And on the topic of AI, there is the right now in Paris there is the conference on AI regulation, and I realized that the UAE, you know, is contributing significantly to a fund where France is looking to develop its AI, and there we have had historic linkages with India and Africa. Well, India for the diaspora reasons, and then through cricket, and Indian technology. Well, Indian human capacity is what drives a lot of AI innovation in the US. Do you think it's time for us to change our orientation away from Western technologies and start looking towards our partners in India, our partners on the African continent, and even in China, where DeepSeek was created for a fraction of the budget of what OpenAI does? And the thing what we know about AI is as good as what you put in. So do you think it is time for us to change our orientation and to build and leverage the historic linkages we have with countries like India, where technology is you know, advancing rapidly, they're making investments, and where we can learn because we share the global south with these countries? Do you think it is time for us to, you know, build linkage with these countries so that our impact on AI would be relevant and our footprint, because AI would not recognize if nothing is put in. And I mean, I applaud the work that you guys are doing here at UWI, because, you know, we have to build our own database so that AI can be responsive to our needs. But that is my thing. Do you think we should move away from this Western orientation and look in the South? Because the South, I mean, whether it's China, I mean, we have an asymmetric relationship with China, where we just open up ourselves to them, they build some roads, and we vote for them on the Taiwan issue and various issues. Isn't it time for us to redefine those relationships where we actually can benefit from the technology that they're developing, and, you know, and be able to craft it, be able to send our students to India, to their Institute of Technology, so they can learn and then bring these technologies back? That is one. And two, the technology revolution requires a lot of capital, and that is something that our government seem not to have. Just a question, based on your observations in Jamaica and, you know, any research you've done in the Caribbean, do you see an appetite within our corporate structures, our corporate establishment, to actually invest in technologies that would help the development of the region? Thank you.
You want to go first, Rose, or you want to?
I can jump in quickly. Just a couple of things there. I think, first of all, we have to see that development, democracy, you know, the future of our country is in our hands as people. The country belongs to us, not the people we elect. They work for us. I think that basic understanding that, you know, this, you know, we are the owners, and that we engage our representatives to really speak and make decisions on our behalf. I think that core idea of what we're trying to do in a democracy has to be honed in. And I say that especially because the expression of democracy across the world has been such that people have been disillusioned. You're seeing it happening right now. It's not delivered the expected outcomes that we all want. And so whether we call it democracy or what have you, it is about a system of governance, a governmental arrangement in which we put reps in power to represent us. Having said that, how we get that kind of understanding and translating that understanding to action is really about public engagement, dialogue, going into communities, utilizing all the agencies we have for public education, universities, the NGOs, churches, church groups. I do a lot of that work, and when I engage communities, this is not. They understand. There's a dialogue, because I go there, certainly in the context of the constitutional discussions about what is it that you want. And I'm not there to say this is how the Constitution should look. I clearly have my own views, but I listen to people in communities, and the perspectives that I brought to that particular community could be replicated across a lot of other communities in Jamaica facing similar problems, that they have challenges, and they feel powerless to act because they have limited resources and limited capacity to maneuver the existing arrangement. And in that sense, people get it that we can create a different outcomes if we make different constitutional changes and other legal related changes that gives them the right to, and the resources to act and to create the resources. I'm not just suggesting that, we go after more of a limited pie, but importantly, we expand the pie, but we have the capacity and the resources to do so, and so on. And then lastly, the active engagement in this process is key, because so many of us are so disillusioned. We don't want to engage in the political process and the elections and so on and so on. But I think we have to engage. We have to build that momentum among the citizenry about how they see themselves, what they want, and what they expect from the people they represent. And I think it is when we get enough people to demand that we want a different kind of governance arrangement that we get different outcomes.
So you had two things. You said one, that we should move away from the Western dependence on technology. Always good, but the realities are that we are already interacting with Chinese company for an Indian company in Trinidad in particular. There's an Indian company that is doing some work with the Unified Payment Interface System, and that same company is also working here in the Caribbean. Most recently, India had proposed the funding of small and medium-sized enterprises to the Caribbean for a technology-based project that came out of a recent meeting in India. So we already have that connection with India. We have that connection with Israel. There are a lot of cybersecurity companies, Israeli cybersecurity companies that are operating in the Caribbean and are providing services to Caribbean governments, and also companies from Brazil and Argentina as well. So we are, and Mexico. So we are working with many different companies, and there are a lot of other small firms that are across the Caribbean that have partners with their Indian counterpart, largely because of cost. It's much cheaper to engage someone in India in that regard. I must say, interestingly, so I needed to develop an app, and I was searching for someone to help me to develop the app. I called a couple of persons here in Jamaica, and the price was 50,000 US, 30,000 US. And someone said I should go on Fiverr, which I did. And this is just to show you how global we are, and how even moving away doesn't necessarily need to be a national imperative. You as an individual have the power to do so. And I registered and logged on to Fiverr, and I typed in, I need an app developer. So Fiverr is an app with persons with digital skills that make their services available, and they can sell you the services. And I said I needed an AI, someone to develop an app using AI. And I gave the specification that I pulled from ChatGPT. And within 20 minutes, I had like 6 persons reaching out to me to develop that app, which was developed by one of them. But interestingly, so it didn't cost me more than $100 US. They're all from India. But one was from Pakistan, and one was from India, but living in Indonesia. And they all they're all offering to use AI to make the application. And to be quite frank, I could have done this myself by going into ChatGPT and asking ChatGPT to give me algorithm that can create an app for the Apple Store and the Google Store. And it would give me the instructions in terms of where to put it and do it myself, but I didn't have the time, so $50. But that just goes to show that the world is accessible to us now, not just the fact that we've traditionally worked with UK, Canada, and the US, or traditional trade partners, but the world is now accessible to us. In terms of, I think you said something about the government funding AI, and I just wanted to say that there are many different funding solutions where AI is concerned. You have multilateral banks that are giving grants from the Middle East to Asia to Europe. We have venture capital and private equity firms that are giving grants and are also investing in small firms that they are picking as big winners. There are a number of public-private partnerships in different countries, or even in countries that you can get access to if you're developing an app that has a global appeal. And of course, we have the typical international development programs, which are now scaling up their operations as it relates to offering solutions for AI. It's just a matter of months before the term, if it has not already been coined, AI for development. And of course, we have the corporate social responsibility. We have a lot of big companies like Accenture and DeGrant and a couple of cybersecurity companies that give out grants at the most that they've ever seen them giving out is probably $100,000. Bill and Melinda Gates, I didn't mention the foundations, I should have. The Bill and Melinda Gates, you can get up to $6 million for a project, a funding project. So institutions like universities and civil society organizations now have an entire network of options that they can access to get funds. They said funding, to get funding to support their AI-related initiatives. You don't necessarily need to use the government. So even if the government doesn't have that intention or is not investing in that regard, there are other persons who see the value of it and recognize that it is a global initiative now. So they're looking out for persons with solutions that they can invest in and generate incomes for themselves. And it's important for people to recognize that that is something that persons can tap into to be able to generate incomes for themselves. And in countries or even institutions can create national programs around it. I'm looking at without going into details, a national program around dropshipping, where in Jamaica here, persons have social programs around dropshipping, where they take high school dropouts, 16 to 21, teach them how to do dropshipping, Amazon to Alibaba or AliExpress. And they, who are doing the dropshipping themselves, get an average of, how do I work it out in US? An average of $30 a day. And I can only imagine what the companies are getting that are paying them to do the dropshipping. I mean, the options are, to be quite frank, limitless. And we need to try to start to explore these alternative solutions for development, whether from a micro or a macro perspective, because other countries are doing so, and India, Indonesia, Thailand, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu. These are all countries that are doing so in Africa, and a number of countries in Africa as well, and are reaping the benefits from it. So I think it's something that we need to start to look at in more depth, and we don't necessarily need to wait on the government to do so. We can do it ourselves and seek funding elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Waller. Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions because we're now running way over time. Doreen Duncan, go ahead, open the mic and ask a question.
Hi. Are you hearing me?
Yes, go ahead. We're hearing you.
My question was for, I think Dr. Usha is her name. I really appreciated the sort of, self-reflection of law as a subject area and as a profession, and its role in perpetuating capitalism, but also colonialism. And I'm curious because I think you had mentioned that the work you're doing, there is some sort of UA partnership. I'm curious about sort of the status quo at UA, or just general the legal fraternity in Jamaica and the Caribbean. How responsive have they been to these sort of more anti-colonial approaches to law, particularly because we have a context here in Jamaica where I think we're pretty conservative, and I think there is the lots of people who hold the law as moral standing, right? And that what the law says you need to do, regardless of the context in which a law was created. So I guess I'm just curious about how the work and the sort of different approaches you're having with different approaches to law are working within this more conservative context.
Do you want me to answer now or wait?
Okay. Yeah, you should. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. That's an excellent question and obviously something I'm very interested in. My experience, very limited experience because I'm new to the region, has been extremely positive. In the small amount of time I've been here, I've found multiple colleagues in both law and law adjacent fields like sociology of law, anthropology of law, and so on, who are deeply engaged in this work. But I'm very keen to incorporate and bring them into this Global South network that's engaging in these efforts, because I think that's mutually beneficial, because Caribbean thinkers have been so fundamental to post-colonial and decolonial thinking across the Global South. I myself have benefited immensely from Fanon and Césaire and countless thinkers from this region, whose influence obviously goes beyond law. So I think that there's a history that legal scholars in the Caribbean can easily draw on. I think the reason it hasn't happened is partly because of the law and development history I talked about, in that there's been this mass transplantation of legal education that makes law very, very, very conservative as a profession all across the Global South. And we tend to kind of crawl along behind the other social sciences, a few years behind everyone else to come to these insights. That's fine, but we have come to them, and I think that we need to basically realize that our experiences with law are not marginal. They're not a sort of inclusivity, diversity, additional extra to be added onto the syllabus, that we're the majority of the world and our experiences with law are in fact actually the mainstream, and to be able to teach and educate lawyers in that way. And I'm super optimistic about this. I'm going to invest in making these connections myself, whether through grants or through international collaborations on these issues. And as I said, I don't think that the Caribbean is sort of following along. I think it's been a leader in these fields. It's just that law is always a little bit behind all over the world when it comes to these kinds of efforts. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. Okay, our next question, and I think, okay, from Ramona, and our final question will come from Godiva. Okay, go ahead, Ramona.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. I just wanted to add to Usha's comment. Being located in the Faculty of Law, I could share from what's happening within the faculty with regards to that last question. So I'm actually very happy that Usha is visiting us, and we collaborate with her on TWAIL, on Third World Approaches to International Law. And as she mentioned, we actually have organized a research hub for decolonial research and law here in the Faculty of Law that gathers colleagues within the Faculty of Law and outside of the Faculty of Law that are concerned with, are dedicating their research and practice to decolonial and post-colonial approach to law, utilizing law. And I could also add that there are other colleagues within the Faculty of Law in their different disciplines that are taking a different approach to law and challenging the status quo within the law. And I could give the example of my colleague, Dr. Celia Blake, who looks at law and linguistics, Professor Tracy Robinson, and also within the curriculum, we are making efforts to really expand the way that in which we are teaching law to our undergrad and grad students, so that we are not focused only on this Anglo-Saxon way of understanding the law, legal theories, and philosophy of law. So for instance, in courses like the jurisprudence, we are now teaching students Charles Mills and Simeon McIntosh, that are Caribbean jurisprudence scholars and philosophers. So these are just a couple of examples where from what is considered a traditional discipline of law, researchers and practitioners within the Caribbean are interested and concerned with expanding beyond, and it's very important for us to collaborate with other disciplines to really challenge the tradition of the law. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to make that comment.
You're welcome. Go ahead, Godiva, and then I'll give Yusha the final say. Go ahead, Godiva. Godiva? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi,
go ahead.
good afternoon, everyone. Are you hearing me well?
Sure, loud and clear.
Wonderful. Such a rich discussion. I really tuned in because of all the angles for decolonization that has come up. One of the things that have really honed in here is the core periphery model. I'm curious, just pointing out a few things that I heard coming up in discussion. One is basically the positioning of AI as simply a tool, and a tool that can be applied in multiple domains. And with that, I would love to hear from each of the speakers. Prof. Marshall, I'm pointing you out here, Prof. Waller, in terms of what does data indigenization look like? Because the truth of the matter is AI, or just technology as it has been created, has been mostly focused on the global north, not the global south. As much as we do have, innovators coming up from China, India, we are still behind. When you take, for example, the fact that a lot of these models were trained on data entry clerks from Kenya, where there was cheap labor. And I feel as if we're entering a sort of dynamic now where even the data that we provide to these models is another way of introducing cheap information that can then be exploited. And I also say that in the context of the data protections that we do not have as Caribbean countries, which are extended to states in California, that are extended to countries within the European Union. So how do we focus on data indigenization and protection within the context of the core periphery model? And my second question is, what are some of the ongoing conversations about the degree of utilization in the Caribbean? Because certainly, Prof. Waller had mentioned earlier that somebody can basically go on WhatsApp, use the Llama model to ask questions. It's one of the things that I encourage even my own mom to do, because many of us in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, we still have lagging literacy rates, and this is adult literacy included. And so being able to go on your phone, send a voice note, and get a written message to send out or spell a word is a big thing for a population. So within that context, how do we see us increasing the degree of utilization? Yes, in terms of being able to use it like Google, but moving also into the realm of AI agents, as well as creation tools and model creation. So those are my two questions. I hope as many of you can answer as possible. And so I'll just wrap it up. It is the context of data indigenization and protection, and also how do we look at degrees of utilization and getting our people to sort of advance the degree of utilization.
Okay, thank you very much, Godiva.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So DeepSeek, ChatGPT, are all creatures of OpenAI. Indonesia is building a model. Japan just built a model. Russia has been building a model for a while now. The thing is, the use of the technology it's open technology, so anyone can do it. Some countries are more motivated than others. Some technical persons are motivated than others. Earlier I made the point about talent, and its connection to salaries, and I think this is where the issue is. A lot of the talent seem to go overseas to work with overseas companies for money. We don't in the Caribbean have the kinds of incentives that encourage persons to stay here and work here. So that's the first thing to take into consideration. But if we did have them here, and if we did have a national policy or a CARICOM policy, and I mean a serious policy, not just to say we're going to sit in a meeting and talk about AI because it's the politically correct thing to do. But if we did have a very strategic policy, data indigenization would have a lot to do with investing in, for example, let me use SALISES as an example, investing in the necessary scanners, investing in the necessary human resources to scan and digitize the local data that is not accessible. We're talking about reports, even MSc thesis, PhD thesis, concept papers, a lot of, and even surveys that were done. SALISES Doc Center, the data bank has data sets ranging from as far back as, help me Richard, perhaps I may be wrong, but we have data sets ranging from as far back as the 1980s with Carl Stone. That it's just there currently now on a server, on a cloud server. And we have now the opportunity to move all of that over into a kind of digital space now, which now leaves a different concern, which is what you just raised, in terms of how do we protect that data. So I'm just going to look at it in the context of how we're doing it at SALISES. So, the API model that we're using can allow us, or so they say, can allow us to retain the data that we scan. So we have a SALISES archive. Uploaded on that API system that has its algorithm, AI working with it, will have a tool that prevents you from accessing our data, but allows our data to pull information from outside and help to augment whatever you're looking for. So those are options that are available to persons. Very often in goodwill, many persons allow for the external firms to access their data, especially given the fact that it was already open source. So in goodwill, it is generally recognized that you're giving me the application and the tools to do this for free, and we're giving it to you because we want information to flow globally, or so they say, and as such, it's generally encouraged that we share the data. So the important thing for you to know here is that the APIs have the option to restrict the data from being accessible externally, but still allow persons to share, to search that database, and still allow that database, that algorithm, to pull information from China, the United States, and wherever, and integrate it into what is there now without sharing that information outside. So that is something that you have to recognize can happen. And in the very same way that we're concerned about persons in LA accessing our data, just remember the algorithms, again, and so they say, pulls from, it is a particular process that it uses to pull data. So it's not going to, unless you tell it to go first to the Caribbean, which is generally not the first point of entry when it pulls the data, unless you tell it to do that. When it goes through that split-second process of analyzing and going across and surveying and identifying what it wants and putting it together, you can actually, with the new open source ones, you can actually go in and tell it what to do. So there is a lot of control over the application. There are some limitations, I'm going to be honest. There are some limitations. And then, of course, there are things that may happen in the background that we don't know, but that's just a risk we take, because there are things that happen in the background of the mobile phone that we don't know, and the computer and the Zoom app that we're using that we don't know, but we just trust in the fact that, in the interest of ethics, that we're not being monitored, data is not being taken away. There's no restrictions on how to use the application because of who we are. And in this globalized world, last thing, in this globalized world, it is not in the interest of tech firms to showcase that their technologies have such vulnerabilities. It will have significant impact on their profitability. I hope I've answered questions. I don't see Kevin, but I see Dylan has his hand up.
Okay. I thought he said he wasn't allowing any more questions.
No, he said it. I just said Dylan has his hand up, and I'm not taking over the moderator's role, Dylan.
Okay. Well, let me seize the opportunity of asking two questions.
Sure.
Every technological revolution or leap, we had the ambition that we'll do well and that there is opportunity, and yet it's always exhausted itself. And I think it's exhausted itself because we don't build a technological capacity. And that is why Cuba has generated, of all the countries in the Caribbean, more patents than anybody else, because they have technological capacity. So my question to you, Professor, is in the absence of this failing technological capacity, because in the 70s, we were doing relatively well. We've lost it because we were told by the IMF that we don't need to build it. Go on the shelf. It's all open competition. Just get it on the shelf. So my question is how you see your ambition in the light of this low technological capacity and a falling education system. The second question I want to ask, is the business of law. In the absence of a lack of a supernatural national authority, we know that the UN is a toothless bulldog. The question is, what does international law mean in a context in which one president could tear up a whole trade agreement and other agreements? In other words, how you square this business of international law in the context of very powerful states with no overarching authority? Is it not, in a sense, the law of the strongest?
Okay, so Dylan, let me just quickly respond before someone else responds to the law aspect.
Yeah.
So that I do have an article somewhere out there called "Slaves to Foreign Technology" that agrees with what you just said. However, if I'm going to be honest with myself, and given my knowledge of, because I've studied these technologies from the steam engine straight across, my PhD thesis did cover, this 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is industry, call it 4 or 5. The thing is, the technology that is here now, and I said it earlier, and I keep on saying, though not a magic bullet, it's a more appropriate type of technology than the previous ones. And I can sit and go step by step by step by step, in terms of how empowering it is, how democratic it is, how scalable it is, how customizable / personalizable it is. It's for the first time ever that we've ever had access to a technology that we can use ourselves, and they don't have to be calling Microsoft to send the people to come here to come help you to fix it, or you don't pay money for your Microsoft 365 and then tomorrow morning when you have that urgent thing to write, they cut down from Microsoft headquarters, they just cut the application because you didn't pay your money or you owe $1 on it. So it doesn't come with those kind of trippings. And again, I'm going to caution and say it is not a magic bullet, because there are some algorithmic kinds of limitations that do exist. But based on what it has been used to do thus far, A, and B, what other persons are using it to do in countries around the world as it relates to the decolonial project, without even saying that they're doing so, it does have that potential, to be quite frank. And I'm saying also the second caveat is it's still early days.
Okay. All right, and that's the final question. So, all right, I know we are way in our lunchtime, so we're going to just close the webinar now. But let me say, this has been a fruitful, provocative, and rich discussion. We have seen a diverse and a multiplicity of perspectives of how we can move development forward in the Caribbean, but also in the global South. And this is what SALISES is all about. We're about highlighting relevant issues. We are about highlighting issues that touch the core of our welfare in the global south, and in particular in the Caribbean. So let me say thank you to everyone who has made this webinar such a success. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to everyone in the background who work on the technology, the admin staff. And let me say thank you to the audience who stay with us right through this webinar. It implies to me that it has been an informative and rich discussion. And I invite you to the next webinar a couple of months from now, when we will also have a rich discussion. So thank you again, and all the best. Bye.